Hi friends, welcome back to the channel. Today's video is just going to be a quick little chat about all of the books that I read over the past 2 months. I read 4 books in June and 6 books in July, which is not particularly ideal, but you know, July was the best reading month of the year thus far, so I mean, technically, I'm on an incline, right? You know, these ADHD meds I've been taking have been working, apparently. I read 4 fiction books in June, 2 fiction books in July, and then 4 non-fiction books in July, so I'm gonna start over the books that I read in June first. I first have The Prophet by Khalil Gibran, which is a modern classic, a beloved classic about this prophet who is leaving his people, but before he gets to go, his disciples ask him for some last pieces of advice on different aspects of life, and so that's what he does, and that's what this book is. It's essentially him sort of telling these people how to live their lives while he's not there. Not really telling them how to live their lives, but giving them advice, sharing wisdom. And it was a really extraordinary and beautifully written book. I can see why it has resonated with people so much. The thing that stood out to me the most was the whole idea of teaching being this liberatory practice that, you know, is not just somebody sort of like disseminating information or knowledge onto this other person who's like a passive receptacle, but rather guiding someone in the learning process by using language to build on what they already know. I thought that was such a beautiful way of looking at like the act of teaching, and it's just a really great book overall. I think I gave this like 3.5 to 4 stars. It definitely did not resonate with me in the way that most people seem to love this book, but it was still a pretty powerful and impactful read, and I'm ultimately glad that I finally read it. Next up we have The Island of Missing Trees by Elif Shafak. This is a book that was shortlisted for the Women's Prize, and it takes place between London and Cyprus from the 1970s to the early 2010s, and we're following a family. We first have Kostas and Daphne, who are both from Cyprus. Kostas is Greek, Daphne is Turkish, so there's a lot of, you know, tension between their families and their communities, and nobody approves of their relationship and their love. They end up leaving and going to London together, where they have their daughter Ada, and after a couple of years, Daphne eventually passes away. So the book is told from Ada's perspective in the future, as well as Kostas's perspective in the past, but then we also get this third perspective from a fig tree, a literal fig tree that Kostas brought with him from Cyprus to London as a cutting, but the fig tree has memories from back when it was a full tree in Cyprus, and so it's also kind of telling its side of the story, and so it's a really interesting thought experiment where, you know, we're sort of questioning, so like what if plants were sentient, and what would they make of us, what would their observations of us be, and how would they make sense of us in relation to them, and I found that to be so fascinating. The story of these characters was great in of itself, but what really struck me the most and resonated with me the most about this book was its exploration of Cypriot history and politics. I knew virtually not much about Cyprus. I did know that there was an ethnic conflict, a division between the Greeks and the Turks, but I didn't know too much about the details of that history and its contemporary ramifications, and this book really taught me a lot about that and got me more curious about it, so I really appreciated the story for that. It was fantastic, and it was my first Elif Shafak read. I'm told by most people that, you know, this is not her strongest work and it shouldn't be the first book that you read from her, but if I enjoyed it that much, I imagine some of her other books must be absolutely fantastic. So yeah, I give this 4.5 stars. Another Women's Prize shortlisted book that I read was Great Circle by Maggie Shipstead, and this is one that I had been chugging through for quite some time because it's a very thick and densely written book. This one takes place mostly in the US, and it also takes place between 2 timelines. The early 20th century, we're following Marian Graves, a young female pilot who wants to become the first person to circumnavigate the world longitudinally, so over the poles, but she ends up going missing on that journey, never to be seen again. And this is not a spoiler, it's literally like the premise of the story. We're following her from childhood to adulthood, and we are getting her perspective as well as her twin brother's Jamie's perspective as she's sort of just growing up, coming into her womanhood, coming into her own, and trying to make a life for herself as a pilot. And she's such a resilient and fascinating character, and her story was so enthralling. Fast forward to the early 21st century, we're following Hadley Baxter, who is a pilot that ends up landing a role in a movie to play Marian in a biopic, and Hadley is kind of a huge fan of Marian. She's always been fascinated with her because she felt like they had somewhat of a similar upbringing. I will say some of the things that I didn't like about this book would be, firstly, the modern timeline with Hadley Baxter wasn't really necessary. It felt very superfluous, and honestly the story could have done without it, and it could have been just as impactful without that superfluous storyline. And the book itself also is super duper detailed, and it goes on and on and on and into like some of the most detailed descriptions of every single thing, to the point where you're kind of like, do we need all of this? Do we need to know all of this? But I think that's also what makes it a fantastic story at the same time, because the author pays so much meticulous attention to detail, and she has just such like an interdisciplinary understanding that really comes through in this book. She knows a lot about aviation and geography and cartography. She knows a lot about history. This book takes place between both of the world wars. She knows a lot about art as well. So, there's just a lot going on in here that, was very, very interesting to read about and very educational as well. I think because of that, and because of how much I really enjoyed Marianne as a character, as well as her twin brother Jamie, this book will forever be etched in my mind. I gave this 4 stars as well, 4.5 stars. Fantastic, bloody fantastic story. I just shifted my camera a little bit more this way. I feel like it looks better. Anyway, so the last book that I read in June was Cold Enough for Snow by Jessica Orr, which is about this Australian woman who takes her Chinese mother to Japan for a little trip, just the two of them. And it's just them walking around Japan and just kind of like describing everything they see and sort of reflecting a little bit on their relationship and their history with each other, but not too much. And it's the kind of book where you read and you get the sense of, like, if you read this book at a surface level, you're going to question, like, what is the story supposed to be about? Like, what is the big deal? But then when you really get into the nitty-gritty of it, this is a story that, where a lot of the tension and the conflict is, under the surface, right? It's between the lines, and you kind of have to pick up on that as a reader. It's written in a way that's very stream of consciousness, and the further you get into the story, at least for me, the more you realize the narrator might not be super reliable. I don't want to give away or spoil anything, but some questions did come to my mind about her mother and where they are, and it was really interesting. It was really interesting. If you read the book, you probably know what I'm alluding to. I thought it was fine. I give it like 3.5 stars. It wasn't anything spectacular. Like, this book has been, widely critically acclaimed and praised. It won an award for like doing something interesting with the form, which I don't necessarily know that it does, but either way, it was fine. Give it a read. It's really short, so even if you don't like it, it's not like you'll waste your time. Let's move on to July, shall we? We first have Animal Farm by George Orwell. This is a classic, a modern classic that lots of people have read and really loved, and it's my first time finally reading it, and wow, I can see why it's so beloved. It's such a really good book. So Animal Farm takes place on a farm with these anthropomorphic animals who decide to, under the leadership of the pigs, overthrow the farmers, right? And so they have this big revolution or whatever, and it ends up being somewhat of an allegory for the Bolshevik Revolution. And so the book is meant to be a critique of communism, really. I also read it as a critique of capitalism because, for me, I don't know what Orwell's intentions were, but I kind of read this book as a story about, how any governing system can become corrupt so long as, people are in charge, so long as there's some level of hierarchy. The people who are the elite, the people who are at the top, the 1%, they will always want to take advantage of the masses. And so that's really what this story, I think, is trying to get at. It's interesting because it doesn't try to make capitalism look good or anything like that. I mean, the book very much acknowledges that the lives that the animals were living before the revolution was terrible. It doesn't praise capitalism, in the sense that the book acknowledges that the lives that the animals were living, before the farmers were overthrown was still horrible lives, right? Was still exploitative and laborious and, viewed them as nothing but commodities, right? In the way that, people, the masses, the middle classes and the working classes are viewed. And then when they switched over to this new sort of system, right, they talked about how the idea was really good in theory, but then the pigs got corrupted with the power. And so I found it to be a really interesting sort of deconstruction of how, no matter what system is put in place, so long as somebody is in power, there's always going to be an abuse of that power. There's always going to be reproduction of this kind of like hierarchical system where the ones at the top benefit more and benefit off of the labor and exploitation of the ones at the bottom. It was fascinating, and I'm glad I finally read this book. I give it 4 stars. Then I buddy read a book with my really good friend Mello. Together we read a book that just captured my soul and broke my heart. It was Young Mungo by Douglas Stewart. This is a book that has, lots of people talking, especially because Stewart won the Booker Prize for Shuggie Bain 2 years ago. It's kind of interesting because Young Mungo supposedly takes place in a very similar setting. It takes place in like working class Glasgow, and it's about this boy growing up with an alcoholic mother and coming to terms with his queerness. And so that's also kind of what Shuggie Bain is about, but I guess that's kind of like the only similarity, because from what I have heard from reviewers, they are pretty different stories. In the case of Young Mungo, we're following Mungo, as I said, alcoholic mother, queer, working class Glasgow, but the story centers around him meeting a boy who he really likes, but that boy is Catholic, he's Protestant, they're both gay. There's a lot of, religious conflict. His older brother Hamish is in a gang, a Protestant gang, and they're always fighting with the Catholics. So there's a lot of, implications for Mungo's relationship with this boy, not only it being a queer relationship, but obviously having some sort of like political connections as well. I found that the dynamic of the siblings to be really interesting. Mungo's sister is the one who kind of has to sort of take care of everybody, and it really showed how the pressure is often put on the girl child in toxic family scenarios. There's a lot of really interesting exploration of queer identity and growing up as a young queer boy in a working class community defined by politics and violence and all of these different sorts of things. And the book was just really well written. There are some scenes that take place next to a loch or a lake, and they're just so beautifully described, like, the kind of scenery that just makes you want to visit Scotland. It was just such a beautiful story in the way that it was written and told, in the way that these complex and interesting characters were presented to us. The relationship and love between James and Mungo was just so beautiful to read about, and I just want more of it. The ending was a little bit strange. It kind of ended a bit abruptly and very open-endedly, and just in a very strange setting. Almost had to kind of like suspend my disbelief to sort of take it seriously. Felt like a fever dream after like the intensity that was this book. For it to end the way it ended just felt a little bit weird. Interestingly, the main character of Shuggie Bain does make a brief cameo or appearance in Young Mungo, so I'm hoping that Mungo gets a cameo in the next book that Douglas Stewart writes, and that way I can maybe hopefully get a little bit of a hint on how his story ended up. But either way, this was a fabulous book. It was so good, so impactful, one of the best books I read for the year, one of my new all-time favorites. I gave this 5 stars. It was top notch. Let's get into the non-fiction books really quick. First of which I have to talk about is a memoir that I listened to, and that is My Name's Yours, What's Alaska by Alaska Thunderfuck 5000. Alaska is a drag queen. His real name is Justin. He lives his life as a man, but he does female drag. When he's in drag, she uses she, her pronouns, so I'm going to be referring to her as Alaska and with she, her pronouns. Alaska was born and raised in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where she discovered drag, and she eventually moved to LA, where she, continued on her drag journey. And so this book is really just a story about her journey into drag, how she got onto Drag Race, competing on Drag Race season 5, and then eventually going on to win Drag Race All Stars season 2. It was really interesting to just learn about her journey and her introduction to drag, and what drag means to her, how drag has defined her, and how it has allowed a level of self-expression as a queer person for her. And that was just really beautiful, the way that she sort of explored that. What I found to be the most interesting about this book, though, was her discussion of her relationship with Sharon Needles, another drag queen who actually won RuPaul's Drag Race season 4. If you watch season 4, you'll fall in love with Sharon Needles because she's such a sweetheart on the show. But in real life, especially, not just from Alaska, but from hearing about, what she has, done with other people, Sharon is a very questionable person. To say the least, questionable doesn't even, that's honestly an understatement. She's a toxic person from, what people have described. And so Alaska goes into their relationship, the toxicity of their relationship, and how she sort of navigated that and eventually got out of it. And the thing about the book is that Alaska does not shit talk Sharon. She actually writes of Sharon with love and respect, and you could see it in the way that she writes about Sharon in this book, and I really appreciated that. It presented Sharon as a complex human being. It was a very honest exploration of their relationship and how that impacted Justin in his life as he continued to develop in his drag career. It was a great memoir and I enjoyed listening to it. I would definitely give it around 3.5 stars. I read another memoir type thing called The Face, a Timecode, or Timecode of a Face, depending on where it's published, by Ruth Ozeki, who is, the author of A Tale for Time Being, which is my favorite book of all time. We've been through this. So this book is part of a project that was done by quite a couple different authors, not only Ruth Ozeki, where they were challenged to sit down in front of a mirror for 3 hours and just stare at their face and write what comes to them. And so this book is a really short and interesting product of that experience that Ruth Ozeki had to kind of sit through. And it's not a 150-page long description of her face. Rather, as you could probably assume, what she's doing is she would start off describing one of her facial features, and then that acts as a catalyst to talk about something in her life. For example, Ruth Ozeki is mixed race. She's white American on her father's side and ethnically Japanese on her mother's side, so she would start off maybe describing some of her Asian facial features, which she would then sort of kind of like move forward into talking about her Asian heritage, what it was like being a mixed race child growing up in the 1950s and 60s, during a time where mixed race people were far less populous, where being mixed race was more taboo, and especially in the sort of immediate post-World War decades, right, with all of the tensions between the US and Japan. The implications for a mixed-race Japanese and white child, it's interesting, right? And so she talked about all of that, but she also just talked about her life in general and other experiences that came out of her observing her face. What surprised me the most about reading this book was how much I knew about Ruth Ozeki's life. And I guess it's because I was such a huge fan of A Tale for the Time Being, and I was really excited when her new book, which I'm still currently reading, Book of Form and Emptiness, came out. I was watching so many interviews with her over the years, and I learned a lot about her life inadvertently without realizing. So a lot of the things that she kind of talks about in this book and reflects on, I kind of knew. Like, one of the things she mentions was that her first ever memory as a child was being, I guess, 2 or 3 years old and coming outside, meeting her Japanese grandparents for the first time, and seeing them sit zazen, or like meditating on the floor. And for her that was so strange because she had never seen an adult sitting on the floor before. That's something she always associated with like being a child. It was just really fascinating, that reflection about that little childhood memory. I find it to be kind of adorable, but also really interesting. I could go on and on and on. Ruth Ozeki is just a brilliant mind, and anything you read from her, you'll just jump on a tangent talking about a whole bunch of things. So yeah, suffice to say, I give this book 4 stars. It was great. Next up, we have The Dawn of Human Culture, a bold new theory on what sparked the Big Bang of human consciousness, which was written by Richard G. Klein with Blake Edgar. This is a paleoanthropology book that is supposedly trying to figure out or hypothesize how the development of symbolic thinking emerged in the Homo sapiens species. So Homo sapiens, our species, our section of the hominin family tree, we've been around for about 300,000 years. Anatomically speaking, we have been around for 300,000 years. Skeletons that look just like us or similar to us have been around for roughly that time. However, archaeological evidence for symbolic thinking and complex thinking and the emergence of culture as we know it today only started showing up in the archaeological records about 50-60,000 years ago. So this book is asking the question, what happened? Why haven't humans been doing all of that since before then? What was the thing that led to the emergence of this phenomenon that has come to define our species, really, and distinguish us from most other species on the planet? So ultimately, their hypothesis is that there had to be some sort of biological or neurological evolution in our brains that shifted us to become smarter, essentially. So even though our bodies and our anatomy has not changed for 300,000 years, neurologically something supposedly changed around, 50, 60,000 years ago, which is an interesting theory, but the book is also very conscious of the fact that, that is not something that can ever be proved, at least not with modern technology, because brains don't fossilize. We only have bones to work off of, right? And archaeological evidence, right? Behavioral evidence, things that humans created, evidence to show that such symbolic thinking and cultural activities were happening. It doesn't prove anything, it just sort of tries to figure out what's going on. But in the process of doing that, obviously, because this book is 200, almost 300 pages, and it doesn't take 300 pages to say the obvious. So in the process of doing that, the book actually goes into a lot of detail about different bones and fossils that have been found over the years, and it really goes into like the emergence of the Australopiths and the first hominins, and really interesting stuff. The main caveat with this book that you have to be careful with, though, is that it was published in 2001. 21 years ago. So this book is fairly outdated, and there are lots of things in here that I'm sure have changed. In fact, there are a few things that I know have definitely changed. Like, for example, the authors of this book say that there's no evidence for humans and Neanderthals interbreeding, which now we know that is not the case whatsoever. Studies since like the 2010s have shown that most humans on the planet, with the exception of those who are fully or exclusively of sub-Saharan African descent, have some small percentage of Neanderthal DNA, right? Which means our ancestors, our Homo sapien ancestors, and the Neanderthals was fucking. And I mean, you don't need science to figure that out. I mean, have you seen the kind of erotica that we read? Bitches out here into tentacles and the coronavirus and all kind of shit. Them was banging. I know them Paleolithic gays was living for them Neanderthals, honey. Let's be real. Where do you think our fascination with bears come from? This is great, though. It was a really great introduction into paleoanthropology. For me, this is a field that I have become so interested in over the past couple of months. So I'm really excited to read more in this field, and hopefully some more updated works. If you have recommendations, please leave them down below. Finally, I read a book for school for my thesis. This is called Islamic Masculinities. It was edited by Lahoucine, Ouzgane. This is the first, I believe, really the first collection published back in 2006. The first book that really deals with the intersection of masculinity studies and Islam and the Muslim world. Really fascinating stuff in here. The first section goes into like a whole philosophical deconstruction of like Islam and mysticism and literalism in Islam and Quranic interpretation. The second section also is really interesting. It focuses specifically on Palestine and Israel because, a lot of really interesting work is coming out of there because of the occupation, how that has affected Palestinian people and specifically Palestinian men. And then the last section has some really interesting essays that are a little bit more miscellaneous, but the one that stood out to me the most was, of course, the one about queer Muslim men and how different queer Muslim men make sense of their queerness and their Muslimness in different ways. Some of them choose to embrace both. Some of them choose to keep the two worlds separate. Some choose to, repress one and embrace the other. Really interesting stuff going on in here. I found it super helpful. I will be citing a lot of these essays in my work. Also, the great thing about reading these kind of books is that, you get more citations because you read what these authors are reading, right? Or you get to know what they're reading through their bibliographies and their references. So that was really great. My only main issue with this is sometimes they sort of like conflate, I guess, like Muslim cultures with Islam, which is not... I'm not the kind of person who gets super triggered by that like other Muslims do, because I don't believe that you can fully separate religion and culture. Like, I just don't. They both shape and build off of each other. Like, let's not delude ourselves. But also, like for example, the essays on Palestinian men, some of them didn't really focus on Islam at all, or like how these men use Islam to make sense of their identities. They were just kind of more so talking about like the Israeli occupation and how that affects the men and their perceptions of their own masculinities and masculine identities. But at the end of the day, this is the first collection of its kind, so I'm sure the editor didn't want to be too picky with what he could have gotten out there. Definitely foundational for people who are looking to get into masculinity studies as it pertains to Muslim societies and communities. So yeah, those are all of the books that I read in June and July. In the comments down below, I'd love to know if you read any of these books, if you have any thoughts on them yourselves. That being said, thank you all ever so much for watching. I hope you have a lovely, lovely day, and until next time, inshallah, keep reading.